Hello, I'm Stefano Maffulli, and I'm the Executive Director of the Open Source Initiative. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about why we needed to define to find a common understanding of what open source means in the context of AI. But before I do, I'll give you a little bit of who we are. The Open Source Initiative is the charitable organization, international charity that guarantees software developers and users have the rights to innovate without seeking permission from the rights holders. And being a charity means that we also work always in the interest of the public and not in the interest of our donors, regardless of their size or the importance of the grants that they give us. And we historically, you may have known us for maintaining the list of approved licenses, the ones that comply with the open source definition. And that's still one of the main activities that we do. But we also have two new programs established. One is the policy and standards, and that's the work that colleague Jordan here, co-speaker, will expose. We have people working to make sure that regulators who are now increasingly paying attention to the IT ecosystem, of which open source is a large and significant chunk of, make policies, make regulations that is compatible with the principles of open source. They don't kill us, basically. And the other thing that we do is the other program is on the advocacy and research. Like, we do look into the future. We do try to understand the world that we live in because it's always changing. We don't want to assume that it's things that worked 15 years ago will continue to work next year or are still working and active today. And it's in this context that in the past couple of years, almost 3 years, we have asked ourselves, what is AI? What is this AI stuff that we're talking about? What are the principles of open source when applied to these new systems that are capable of generating code, images, text, as if they were human-like? And we were surprised by it. And we thought, what are the principles of open source and how do we apply them to AI? Are they still valid? And it was fairly easy to come to a conclusion collectively that an open source AI is the same thing as an open source piece of software. We users, developers, when we receive an AI system, we want to have the possibility the freedoms to use, to study, to modify, and share it. And that was the easy part. But those of you who remember the free software definition by the Free Software Foundation, you will notice that there are two pieces missing from this deck. And next to the right to study and the right to modify, you get a little modifier sentence in the free software definition. It says, access to source code is a precondition for this. So what is source code in the context of AI? For software, we know what it is. It's what the humans write. We know that the humans write code. But for an AI, especially the machine learning, modern machine learning, the source is not written by a human. The machine looks and behaves a little bit like a black box, and it's not easy to understand why it's coming to such conclusions, and more importantly, if it's consistently coming to wrong conclusions and giving wrong answers, wrong suggestions, how do we fix it? That we didn't know. And we didn't also notice another thing, that in the open source definition, point number 2, the concept of source code is specified even more clearly and mandates that the software must be available, first of all, and it must be available in the form that the programmer would use. It cannot be obfuscated in any way. So we have noticed, as we were talking about what is open source for AI, that this was a sticking point. What is that form preferred by a person skilled in the art to study, use, modify, and share an AI system? We knew that replicating that moment of genius that happened in the 80s when Richard Stallman basically came up with a free software definition out of his brilliant brain, in isolation, and he built a community around it over many years. We didn't have many years, and we knew that the community is already established. So forcing the definition of one genius on the minds of millions of people would have been impossible. So we took a different approach. We asked, we designed a collaborative process, a co-design process that was global from the beginning. And using the amount of time that we had, which was very little, we tried to build the largest possible amount of experts from different fields in the same rooms over almost a year of work. We had over 100 people from more than 20 organizations from 27 nations, including from the Global South, funded by the Sloan Foundation to help us, asking what is that preferred form for making modifications to an AI. And we ran it through a process that went through iterations. Like we first had to discuss what an AI system is, and then analyze a few systems, trying to extrapolate the common points from these various experts. Then issue a first draft of that definition. With that draft, expand the search and validate those hypotheses, and that release a candidate version of the open source AI definition that was later approved in October 2024 by the OSAID board. And the conclusion of that process is this. Basically, an open source AI is one that grants you the 4 freedoms. And that means that you have accessibility, unrestricted access to the weights and parameters of the model, the code that was used to build it, the source code for the training, and the source code used for creating that data set, which is equally important, and the complete list of all the data that went into it, including the full data set if you have the right to distribute it. And that's basically what we've done. So now, of course, like version 1 of the definition has been received with a different amount of acceptance and criticisms, but we're also seeing that this year we monitored the space, and we noticed a lot of releases of new models claiming to be open source and having offering as a point of contribution, that open source is actually a spectrum, so that you can have open source that is more open source or less open source, and we push back on this aspect of it because we recognize that there is a spectrum of reality. No one thinks that we're living in a binary world, but open source is a gate on that continuum. So while we have degrees of deprivation all the way to the gate, and after that, you have multiple ways of exercising your freedom. This works for AI as well as it works for software. In fact, in the examples below, I notice how you have in the open source world the Linux kernel with the GPL reciprocal license or the BSD with a different kind of licenses. They're all part of the open source world. They're on this side of the what I call the garden of freedoms. So the questions that we actually need to ask ourselves all the time is, have you received all the tools and the knowledge that you need without any restrictions in order to be able to study, to modify and share and build on top of the work of others? And so we really, as I said, we released version 1 of the open source AI definition at the end of October last year. And we promised the community that this year we were going to watch the space and think about what the evolution of that definition would be. So that's what we're doing this year. We are through the milestone 1. And we're working in fundraising, actually, for establishing an expert working group that will help us evaluate the new model releases as they happen, because we've seen some significant releases at the beginning of the year. And the second step will be to work with this working group to design a process that would help us address issues that the group has identified into the version 1. So we're raising funds, and we're also helping, and we're also collecting use cases. So if you are out there using AI systems, especially not the generative AI that everyone talks about, we're very interested in discovering biotech, medical, computer vision, different kind of machine learning systems where that are trained in a different way, but they're released with one of the approved licenses of the open source initiative, or with permissions in any case to use, study, modify, and share. Please join the forums because we want to know more about those. And if you're expert in the field, talk to me and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. And I'm going to pass the mic to Jordan Maris, let me introduce himself. Got it.
Hope it's working great. Thanks very much, Steph. So my name's Jordan Maris. I am the EU policy analyst for the Open Source Initiative, so I do policy work related to the European Union. The title of this talk contains the word why, and the question of why we needed the OSAID is a really important one. And I'm here to give you one of the possible answers, which is that, well, actually, lawmakers need to know what open source AI is. And to better explain that, I kind of want to tell you a story. So a long time ago, before ChatGPT, before the LLM craze, in a parliament far, far away, well, actually about an hour and a half from here by train, there was the EU's AI Act. And during that process, there were a bunch of people sat in a windowless, stuffy room, and they were negotiating the first round of negotiations on the AI Act. We reached the end of this meeting, and one naive young advisor raised his hand and said, perhaps we should consider open source in all this. And in doing so, created a lot of problems for a lot of people. So what followed after that, essentially, was the EU's first naive, perhaps a little misguided but well-intentioned attempt to consider open source in its regulation. And I was that policy advisor. So after that, I decided to join the OSI, an organization which I have held a lot of respect for a very long time, and who we work with extensively on lots of different digital policy files in the European Union. So another example would be the Cyber Resilience Act, which we worked on with input from the OSI. So I started the job, and my boss from the OSI came to Brussels, so our director of EU policy, Simon Phipps. And I took him on a tour of the town, and by chance, I ran into one of the advisors of the MEPs who worked on the AI Act. And we had a nice chat. I explained to this guy what the OSI do, and he was very excited and immediately said, well, actually, we put this exemption into the AI Act, but what actually is open source AI? And we should have thought it through a bit more. And it's not just in Brussels that this question is being asked. There are adjustments made for open source in China's proposed AI model law. There are similar ones in Canada's Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And right now in the US, there are many state laws on AI in the works, many of which are also considering having exemptions or modifications for open source AI. Now, what I'm here to tell you today really is that the OSAID actually makes sense in the context of these laws, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to join the OSI so much, because it is so far the only definition which really makes sense in the context of the legislation. And I'm going to explain to you why. There are three primary reasons. The first is that the OSAID guarantees you the actual freedom to use the software without limitations. And that's something that is really important, but which unfortunately, as of now, is not the case for some models which are claiming to be open source. It also provides flexibility. It's nice to believe that the world is binary and that we can say yes or no, but unfortunately there are edge cases, there are problems, there are legal complexities, which means that sometimes you need a degree of flexibility in order to make things work, in order to have legal certainty. Now that is something that I believe the OSAID does without compromising the four freedoms. The third is downstream risk analysis and compliance. So people are going to use the AI downstream, and it's important that they can use it while complying with the law. So On freedom to use. In the text of the AI Act, it's written really clearly, essentially, that open source AI can contribute to, quote, research and innovation in the market and provide significant growth opportunities. Now, an AI which doesn't allow you the full freedoms, which doesn't give you the ability to use, modify, redistribute, and study, does not do that. If the AI model you're using to build your AI system is only free for you to use up until you have a certain number of users, it's not open source AI. If the AI model you're using to train your own AI model doesn't allow for that, then it's not open source AI. And allowing models like that to benefit from an exemption would give them an unfair advantage. It would be anti-competitive, but it would also be wrong. And it would prevent the emergence of AI systems which could compete. So thankfully, the EU agrees. And so in their recent guidelines on general purpose AI, they reiterated that the license should allow the model to be used without any restrictions besides those, on attribution and ensuring attribution and distribution of the model or its derivatives. The second one is flexibility. Now, this has been a bit of a sticking point on the OSAID, but I think it's really, really important that we have this discussion, right? So the OSAID introduces this idea of data information, the concept that essentially, rather than providing every piece of data which went into the data set, you can provide detailed descriptions of the data, if possible the URLs of where the data was collected, so that somebody can reproduce the same or an equivalent data set. This actually helps us address a bunch of really serious issues which exist in the AI world at the moment. The first is data protection. So I don't know how many of you guys are from the EU, but you've probably heard of the GDPR. And it could be potentially a big issue. But the key example that we were thinking of when we drafted this was medical AI. We want there to be open source medical AI. And a lot of patients will be very happy with their CT scans being used to train a model to do something good for medical purposes, especially if that model is open source. They might not be happy having their CT scans shared with the public. And those are two different things. And we believe that there needs to be some adjustments made to ensure that it's possible to create these solutions. The second is differences in copyright law between different countries. So I'll take an example. If you take a picture of the statue of David in Italy, and you want to use that to train an AI model, almost everywhere in the European Union, that's fine, except for in Italy, because in Italy, that statue is state copyright. And if you use it for training the model in Italy, your model could get you in a lot of hot water. These differences make it almost impossible, and this is just one. There are differences between all of the EU countries, and there are differences between European copyright law and copyright law in other countries. These make it impossible to know with absolute certainty if your model is A-OK or not. The third reason is a text and data mining exception. So this is a concept in EU copyright law which basically allows companies to train AI on text and data without it infringing on copyright law. The only problem with this is it allows them to train the model. It does not allow them to share the data under their own terms. So it wouldn't be possible to use that exception if it were a requirement. The final one is accidental inclusion of copyrighted content. Datasets are massive, and even among the datasets which endeavor to only include content which is public domain or without copyright, they constantly run into issues. The question that they'd then ask is, what happens if you discover that part of the training data of your AI was copyrighted? You withdraw that piece of training data from your dataset, but then does that mean your model is no longer open source? It shouldn't, but it does. And in that event, what does that mean for your access to exemptions under law? Okay, your model is no longer open source, so suddenly you have to comply with the AI Act in full. So this creates a ton of legal uncertainty. And it's not easy to overcome. It's enough to prevent the emergence of open source AI, and that would be really bad. Finally, there's the downstream risk analysis and compliance thing. So essentially, the greatest thing about open source AI, the key benefit is that people are going to be able to reuse it and build their own stuff. That's always been at the heart of open source. The thing with building your own stuff is you need to comply with the law. And if you're trying to comply with the law, you need to know what the components you've used contain, right? And that's where the freedom to study comes in. It's one of the 4 core freedoms of open source. That freedom to study is the thing that allows you to know if the code you've used to build your AI, if the AI model you've used to build your AI can comply with the law. So the question is, without the data information, without this thing that we've created in the OSAID, how can you, as a developer who's developing a derivative AI, guarantee that the training data in the data set is accurate or of high quality? These are requirements under the EU's AI Act. How can you guarantee that it complies with data protection law? How can you guarantee that there aren't possible biases or safety risks, which maybe weren't evaluated for the initial AI, but which are relevant for your particular use case? How can you guarantee there's not copyrighted material that could get you in hot water? But now also, more importantly, how can you guarantee the security of your model? With data poisoning attacks being a future vector for security vulnerabilities, how can you know that the data set that's used to train the thing isn't poisoned? The answer is you can't, unless you have information on the data used to train the data set. And you don't have to take it from me. A handful of MEPs from the European Parliament recently wrote to the European Commission, so essentially the government of the EU, saying very clearly that a handful of large AI companies are claiming their AI as open source while imposing usage restrictions intended to prevent the emergence of competition and threatening users' safety. They go on to say that the unavailability of information about how essentially the AI model is developed, including data information, would make it, quote, extremely challenging for developers and deployers building on these systems to assess potential risk related to data protection, bias, and copyright, making it impossible for them to confidently comply with the law. Now, this letter was signed by every single member of the European Parliament who worked on the AI Act and who is still in Parliament. So that gives you an idea of the scope. The people who wrote this law are worried about this now. And the OSAID does provide a solution. So takeaways from all this. There are challenges ahead. The issues with compliance are going to pop up, especially for derivative AI models. This could also lead to issues for consumer safety, which will be very unpopular with the public. But above all, it's going to lead to a lot of legal uncertainty for companies who want to build AI. The OSAID addresses these challenges, and I think that is really the added value of open source AI when comparing to open weights, right? You have extra information which allows you to do things that you otherwise would not be able to do. Finally, for now, there are a few open source models, but things are changing. Open source AI is on the way, fully open source AI, which meets the requirements of the OSAID. Examples of this and kind of indicators of this are that, first of all, some proprietary or semi-open models, open weights models, are becoming more open. Recent examples include Granite and DeepSeek, which are opening up more of the code used for inference training, etc. There are also an increased number of open data sets. Secondly, there's the reduced barriers to entry. So there are initiatives both in the EU and the US to provide compute time for AI developers, which will also include open source AI. Third, there's funding. So states are getting interested in funding AI development. The Swiss government is currently funding the development of a Swiss LLM, which will be multilingual as well. Meanwhile, there's a big program set up by the Allen Institute for AI, NVIDIA, and the National Science Foundation, which is also providing funding for AI development. Finally, there are actually ongoing developments to build open source AI already. So recently, Ilu for AI have come out with Comma, their first model trained on entirely open data sets, and the Common Power dataset. So we're seeing improvement in that area, specifically when it comes to data, and hence, we also need to start thinking about data governance, which is where I'm going to pass back over to our executive director, Stefano.
Yeah, thinking of data governance, we knew as of the beginning of the process that data is where the big problem lies. So we wanted to see more. We released last year a research paper, position paper, research paper on the concept of data governance, and we're diving a little bit deeper this year with this conference online that is going to develop between October 1st and 3rd. It's a 3-day virtual event. I encourage you to sign up. We have a tremendous amount of speakers of really high level. So sign up and think about becoming a member of the open source initiative. We take donations from individuals also. And that's it for now. So you can also endorse the open source AI definition, which is still something that we look forward to increase the amount of supporters. Thanks. 3 minutes for questions. We have 3 minutes. Questions? Yeah?
Yeah, hi. Sorry I was late, so I'm not sure if it is already closed, so I already apologize for it. But one thing is that you showed DeepSeek, and DeepSeek is an open weight model, and please correct me if I'm wrong. It doesn't share the data sets.
No.
The second, a follow-up question to that is, most of the open generative AI models that are popular or are getting adopted are open weight models. So are we making peace with it that we won't have open source models, but we will only have open weight models?
No, I want to go back to the picture that I showed. Like, there are two things that we're watching very careful with a lot of interest. And one is that on that road to, this is it, on that road to open source, through that gate, we're watching those who get closer and closer and try to give them incentive. Past the gate, get into the garden. It's more fun over here. So open weights are over there, in the higher part of the road, but we're welcoming them to come closer, right? And the other thing that we are watching is the answer to this question. And technology will evolve. The practice will evolve. It's not unlikely that the understanding of what that preferred form, the form preferred by a developer to modify an AI, will also change. Maybe today, with the current architectures, we need all the things that we have written in the open source AI definition. Maybe tomorrow that's going to be irrelevant because, I don't know, the machine learning will happen in a different way. But the question that we always have to answer is this: do you have all the tools, all the knowledge that is required for you to modify, to study, share?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.
If I can just quickly add it on. With DeepSeek, it's not that it's open source, but it's getting closer. So there's more stuff being published, more code being published, which is used in training the models. And so this sort of inching closer to open source, we consider it as a good thing. But you've got to cross the boundary, and they're not quite there yet. Any other questions?
So how do you reconcile the need so you mentioned that right now, for the licensing, you don't require training data to be made public or for that to be open source. And then you also mentioned that there are security concerns about open source or quote unquote open source AI models that don't have public training data. So how do you sort of reconcile something being called open source but not having sort of the open source security assurances of other open source software?
Shall I take that one?
Sure.
Yeah. So essentially, when it comes to data information, I don't have the exact wording, and I don't think it's in our presentation, unfortunately, but the idea was that you have enough information to reproduce an equivalent data set, right? So what we're seeing in a lot of the data sets that exist currently, especially image data sets, is none of them are actually shipping the images in their data set. Everyone is saying, here's a list of URLs, run this script, and it will build you the data set, right? So that, for us, is a version of data information you could have. Here's a list of all of the URLs you need to build the data set yourself. And so that's kind of the limitation you've got in there. Now, it is completely understandable, especially in higher security cases, that you might want purely open data sets. And the idea of the OSAID's approach to data information as well is that when you have the data information, if you're not happy with using a certain source of data, you have enough information about what data is in that data set that you can build something equivalent, or you can try to find data that's equivalent. And one of the things we hope as well is that in the future, this will spur the creation of more open data sets. And we're seeing that with stuff like Common Power by ELUFA. Thanks. Anyone else?
All right. I
Okay.
think we're at time. Anyway, thank you.